Okay, this is going to be my fourth little audio video here on YouTube. Again, I'm going to be talking a little bit about the RPG hobby. And this time I'm going to be talking about a genre in the hobby that is very seldomly seen. Now, we're all familiar with the fantasy, science fiction genres of the RPG hobby, which are fairly common. There are other genres as well. There's the espionage type genre. There's the D20 modern. There's comedy type lightheartedness like the Paranoia old game system. For a lot of you older gamers out there, you'll know exactly what I'm talking about. But today I want to talk about a genre that is very seldomly the first genre that a gamer in their gaming career or a GM in their GMing career first encounter. The one I want to talk about, of course, is the horror role-playing type games. Now, horror role-playing type games have been out for quite some time now. My first experience with a main campaign setting was the old Ravenloft RPG campaign setting back when it was using the Advanced Dungeons & Dragons 2nd Edition course rules. Since then, you've had World of Darkness, you've had, I believe it's been, other types of horror games have been out there, little knockoffs, but it's never really had a very large following the way that fantasy or science fiction games have. But I wanted to talk a little bit about that and some of the differences and some of the similarities that horror has with other types of RPG settings out there, and also how it's different than a lot of the other RPG settings out there. One of my favorite horror settings in recent years has been the Call of Cthulhu, and I think I'm pronouncing that right. Cthulhu. This, I believe, has gone through 7 or 8 incarnations since the original publication, and I think that it's probably one of the best, not the only, but one of the best settings out there, and it's been translated into various game systems, everything from GURPS to the basic core engine that has been using from Chaosium since as far back as I can remember, to even Savage Worlds, I think, did a Call of Cthulhu setting book. So anyway, we all know what horror is. I think we've all seen horror movies, or we've all read horror novels. Now, the one thing, the popularity of horror goes way beyond RPGs. As I said, it goes into movies, it goes into literature. You can look at some movies like the Friday the 13th series. You can look at some books like the H.P. Lovecraft books, TV shows like the X-Files. A lot of these are horror-based movies or TV shows. Then you have writers like Dean Koontz, Stephen King. Stephen King has done a lot of miniseries that have appeared on television, broadcast television. And, horror has its roots as far back as I think anyone can really say that human beings have been on the planet. Fear is probably one of the most primal and one of the most basic of emotions. And if you look at even some of the fairy tales by, say, like the Brothers Grimm, and these, they're read to mostly young children at a very early age, what they really are thinly cloaked tales of dread and terror and horror and other very unpleasant things that can happen to an individual. Now, unfortunately, for a lot of gamers, when they first start playing horror games, they tend to become discouraged. And I think that one of the we're going to talk a little bit about one of the reasons for that. And we're going to also talk about, if this horror genre is so familiar, then why is it that RPG players become so frustrated? I think what it is because the answer, I believe, is the expectations that, say, a fantasy gamer brings to a game, a horror game. And they try to do many of the same things that they would in a fantasy setting with their PCs. And they usually find their characters in dire straits when they try to do that. They forget that fantasy and horror are two separate games with two separate sets of rules. And we're going to explore a little bit of the differences there. Now, one of the first and probably the most important aspect to remember when you're playing a PC in a fantasy campaign as opposed to a horror campaign is that in a fantasy campaign, a PC is basically a hero. You know, he goes in, or he or she goes in, and they basically, totally, give the bad guy a thrashing, basically. With the major difference with a horror RPG PC is that the characters, the PCs, NPCs, are victims. And yes, I said victims. And what I mean by that is in the sense that they are just as vulnerable to the menace, to the monster, to the creature, to whoever or whatever the nemesis or whatever generates the horror within that campaign setting. And they're just as vulnerable as anyone else. Now, that's not to say that a character won't survive. Although in some campaigns, say like Call of Cthulhu, the survivability rate is really quite low. What it really means is that they are in jeopardy as same as anyone else. Now, in horror RPGs, even the smallest encounter can turn deadly in an instant. Take, for example, a pack of rats in a sewer. A total rat swarm coming through a sewer. In a fantasy RPG, this is a trivial encounter for most PCs or for most parties. In horror RPGs, the rats would suddenly swarm over the character, crawl over his or her body, and devour them alive. In that sense, the hero has become a victim. And horrible encounters provoke potentially crippling emotions in a character. Again, the sanity deterioration, say like in a game like Call of Cthulhu. Now, that isn't to say that the PCs in a horror game are not heroes. Now, not heroes in the sense that the hero strides in, weapon in hand, and vanquishes his foe. If you're asking if they're that type of hero, then the answer is no. Characters in horror RPGs tend to be heroes in the sense that they do what must be done because it needs to be done. And the consequences for failure are even more unthinkable than the risk. They feel the fear and uncertainty, but stand against the menace nonetheless. Many times they give their very lives to defeat the menace. Now, in some horror RPGs, you may play a not quite human character. You may play a vampire or a werewolf or some other form of mythological horror-inspired creature in which the characters themselves may actually be part of the menace or are in some way playing a more dark fantasy type genre within the horror genre in and of itself. Now, we're going to be focusing more on classic horror in which the PCs are more human in nature, just everyday people, or even with people with a certain amount of skills, but still, even with those skills, the menace is very real. Now, one of the things also to remember about a horror type RPG in which your PCs are normal people or fairly normal people is there's another aspect that differentiates fantasy RPGs from horror RPGs is the concept of no guarantees. Now, in fantasy, heroes overcome great obstacles and triumph in the end. Some heroes may lose their lives, but they never die in vain. No matter how dark things get in fantasy RPGs, good always triumphs over evil. Now, horror offers no such guarantees. Evil frequently overcomes good, even if good is victorious. Lives are forever changed and never for the better, and death often comes too soon. Now, I remember a game in which I and a couple of friends of mine were actually playing a horror campaign many years ago, and the general consensus after the one-shot type adventure was done is that most of the PCs got killed off. I think out of the 4 or 5 PCs or players that were actually playing the game, of those 4 or 5 players, I think 4 of them lost their PCs. Now, the consensus at the time was you can do everything right and still end up getting killed. And at the time, they thought that was basically a strike against what they thought was against the system we were playing. Now, later on, they came to realize that this is just a fact of the genre in which we're playing in, the horror genre. In horror RPGs, you cannot win every encounter, nor you're supposed to. That's the nature of horror and the nature of the mortality and as I spoke earlier, the vulnerability of the PCs. Now, the concept of balanced encounters, pretty much it does not exist in horror RPGs. Usually the menace or the monster or the baddies are a lot more powerful than the PCs. And sometimes getting away alive a PC is basically the best you can hope for. It's might be the goal of the entire scenario. Now, most who play horror RPGs do not mind their characters getting killed, as long as it furthers the story, as long as it is atmospheric in the sense that it complements the horror and the feeling of dread within the campaign. And of course, it never hurts if the character dies spectacularly as well. Now, horror and horror RPGs push aside the rational thoughts and evoke strong emotions. And that's basically the core center, if you will, of fear. Fear is all about emotion and very little rational thought. Now, at the climax of a really good scenario, everyone, if you're running as a horror campaign as a GM, everyone should be at the edge of their seat, and any sudden unexpected noise could cause the entire group to jump. Players will feel the excitement, the fear, the suspense, and they are no longer outside observers but participants in the horror. Now, there's a lot of ways to get this effect if you wanted to get this effect with people. One of the easiest ways to do this is dim the lights a little bit. I'm a big fan of a lot of us have these lights that have different brightness settings. If you're playing in the living room or in the basement or in a certain room in the house where you do the RPGs, a game room or something of some sorts, dim the lights a little bit. That can add a lot to the mood as well. Certain noises, there's really some good programs out there that you can use on your pad with a good portable Wi-Fi speaker. And you can basically trigger and cue these sounds at very appropriate moments. So you can actually get, if your storytelling is correct, if your storytelling is atmospheric for the horror genre, you can actually get some real jumps and startles from the group around you. It's really about causing a feeling of unease as well in the players, as well as creating a good horrific type story that Stephen King or Dean Koontz would be proud to put forward. Now, horror RPGs may also draw out strong emotions, but forethought, investigation, and planning are still important in the game. They can mean the difference between life and death of the characters. Many thinkers continue to play horror RPGs because of these elements. Just do not expect their plans they don't expect them to work out every time. Remember, sometimes you can do everything right and still get killed. Um, the whole concept of the investigator, the planning, the forethought, it's no different than some horror type movies that are out there. Or again, I go back to the Call of Cthulhu, where you play basically investigators investigating the mythos threats to the community or to the world at large. So these are actually thinking men type games. It's where you really can rush in, gun or blaster or sword in hand, and expect to get very far in these type of games. It requires a little more thought, a little more forethought in how do we defeat this menace. It's not simply a 3 HD type creature in the you know room 3 of a dungeon that you kill them and you take their stuff and then you move on. And this is actually a major menace which in order to be defeated properly or at all would require an individual to give some thought and some investigation as to how to actually defeat the creature. Now, I also want to talk about another aspect of the horror genre, which is called, or what I like to call, the perversion of reality. While fantasy often creates a new or ancient new, meaning that it has trappings of the ancient world, but it's also spun in a new way, and sometimes better world, according to their own fantasy rules of the setting or campaign, horror prefers to corrupt our own world. It lulls us into a false sense of security by presenting a believable plot and characters in familiar settings. You look at any Stephen King movie or Stephen King novel, and they all have believable plots. They all have believable characters who could be our next door neighbors, our co-workers, and very believable settings. Small towns, hometowns. But what it does, what horror does, and Stephen King does, and any good horror writer, movie maker, or GM would do, is it then takes that and it rips that security away. Most horror RPGs are set in a modified real world, where everything's the same in our world except maybe there's the unknown, there's the mad slasher, there's the creature of the Cthulhu mythos, or some other menace exists. Now, while evil in fantasy is dramatic and larger than life, the perversion of horror is subtle, and it occurs where we least expect it. Just look at some of the I believe the movies were called the Omen setting. This was back Omen, which is OMEN, series of movies. I think these went back into the 70s, but they were very good movies where basically it took the an orphan child and it made him a very interesting character, to say the least, and used him as a focal point for a horror type series of movies. Now, that's one example right there. And, you can take that perversion, you just pervert reality, change it up, make it something where it's something mundane, and you take it and you twist it and you basically inject, for lack of a better term, you inject evil into it, or malice or malintent for the PCs or their community as a whole, and you have a fairly good horror campaign. Now, one of the things I want to talk about as well too here before I forget is in horror there's basically two types of horror. And when I first heard this, I was basically pretty much blown back and blown away by the sheer genius of this examination of how all horror can be broken down into two separate types. Now, bear in mind that I've been a fan of horror for the past 30 years, if not more. And I wouldn't say it's my favorite genre of all, but I like to see it occasionally. for the simple fact that it's a genre that presents aspects and presents a form of entertainment that other forms of entertainment and other genres do not. But I like to see it done well. But basically, horror can be broken down into two separate facets. Now, imagine, if you will, and just kind of bear with me and work with me here as I'm explaining this, is that we, meaning us, whether we're GMs or players or writers, movie producers, or just ordinary people working our regular jobs, that we are who we are, but we're not in the modern world. We're sitting around a campfire in prehistoric times, and the shaman or the medicine man gets up and he says, either to a question or as a lesson, what is the nature of evil? Because that's really what the horror genre and horror RPGs are really dealing with and exploring, is basically the concept and the origin, the motivation, and the continuation and or expansion of evil. And the shaman will get up and he'll tell us evil comes from out there, and he moves his arms and points out word, beyond those trees, beyond the next forest, the next tribe, the spirits that live beyond the known world. That's the external form of horror. You can look at certain movies. Take, for example, like John Carpenter's The Thing, Ridley Scott's Alien. You could take, again, the Omen series, which I would recommend watching. Steven Spielberg's Poltergeist movies. These are all examples of evil, the unknown, or the malign entering into human experience from some external source. Not us here, as I use the example, our happy little tribe with our medicine man explaining to us what evil is, but from some external source. The other type of evil is the same situation where we're sitting around a campfire and we're listening to the shaman and the medicine man, and he says, evil's not out there, evil is within us. And you look at that, and you look at, say, like the classic Dracula movies, or the Werewolf in London movies, or you look at, for example, the Friday the 13th or the Halloween series. These are all examples of human beings, or at least one time they were human, and this evil, whether through an event, is now part of them that now comes out and wreaks evil on the world. So you look at horror in general, and they can actually fall within either one of those categories. Now, you can break it down further than that, but those are the two core base motifs or origin points that horror or quote-unquote evil comes from. Now, I want to talk again, going back to the RPG element of horror, is there's another element. We've already talked about the differences between PCs in fantasy and PCs in horror games, where PCs and fantasies are heroes, while PCs in horror games are victims. We talked about no guarantees. Nothing is guaranteed within a horror RPG campaign or one-shot game. Also about emotions, that horror invokes emotions, although there can be it's emotionally driven scenarios, but it can involve investigation and clue searching and so forth. We talked about the perversion of reality. You take that security and you rip it away. But I also want to talk a little bit of what is known as dark stereotypes. Now, in fantasy, it's a genre basically about valiant heroes and terrible villains that need to be overcome, whether it's the gallant knight, the gray-haired wizard, the scheming dragon, the maiden in distress, the evil sorcerer. These are all fantasy stereotypes. Now, the stereotypes in horror tend to be darker, sometimes corruptions of their fantasy stereotypes themselves. Now, I recommend anyone who's interested in dark fantasy or gothic type fantasy, whether you're playing, World of Darkness by, White Wolf Games, whether you're playing some rendition of you maybe Monty Cook's World of Darkness, whether you're playing Call of Cthulhu. They all use, sorcerers, or they'll use the standard, knight errants, who may be a vampire, who may be, a werewolf. But they're basically perversions and corruptions of these fantasy stereotypes. Now, monster stereotypes also are abound too. Now, the Wolfman, say like from classic movies, was basically the reluctant monster, basically. Dr. Victor Frankenstein is a prototype of the mad scientist, just as Dracula is still the standard that we use up to, very modern times for vampires. Now, taken for example, like Frankenstein's monster is basically the poster child for misunderstood monsters. The Phantom of the Opera is basically the classic madman seeking revenge. And maniacs such as Norman Bates from Psycho, still invoke strong emotions when, maybe our thought wanders a little bit to Alfred Hitchcock when we're taking a shower. And horror has its hero stereotypes too. Most are similar to fantasy stereotypes mentioned above. For example, the occult expert who's dedicated his life to studying and battling evil, such as Dr. Van Helsing, have similarities to fantasy wizards like Merlin or Gandalf. There's usually a maiden to be rescued by a dashing young man, the gallant knight in modern form. Heroes were mainstays in older classic literature and films, say through the 1960s, but today these images are either absent or they're corrupted or of versions of their former selves. A good example is like the 1930s Dracula, to say like the 1990s version of Bram Stoker's Dracula, where you had Van Helsing in both stories, but one was presented a lot differently than the other. The Bram Stoker's 1990s Dracula was a much more darker, less stable, which was played very well by Anthony Hopkins. And he bears really more resemblance to a Call of Cthulhu investigator who has lost more than a few sanity points than, say, Van Helsing from the 1931 version. Now, while I've been emphasizing the difference between horror and fantasy, remember that they are still closely tied. Both stem basically from ancient legends, and you go back far enough and say like the 1920s and the 1930s, and you look at say like the earliest Conan stories and the Call of Cthulhu, both had their origins in the same magazine, Weird Tales. And you look at some of the Conan type stories, and you're going to see in some of the original writings that there's actually Cthulhu type creatures within that setting. But I'm going to talk a little bit more about the horror genre and RPGs in general, and I'm going to get right to it. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about how to actually play horror type RPGs. While much has been written about the nature of horror and how to write horror scenarios, little attention has actually been played on how to play horror RPGs. Now, I know of only one system whose rulebook gives you any advice for players at all. Consequently, first-time players tend to sit back and let the more experienced players take the field, even if their character is supposed to be outspoken, because horror is not something that a lot of RPG players out there really know about. Some do, and some are very well versed and may play horror RPGs almost exclusively. But while it's probably unwise for a beginner to get certain character types, like say like Dr. Van Helsing, for example, there is still a lot though that any player, even a novice player, can contribute to in a horror type RPG. Um, One thing to remember if you're going to be a player and you're going to develop a PC for a horror type game is survival is secondary. Your PC survival is secondary to the story. And what I mean by that is let's get one thing straight right away. Characters die in horror roleplay games, and that despite a player's best efforts. And sometimes that's because the horror is too great, too terrible, too fast, too mean, too hungry. Even a creature that might seem weak could overpower and kill a character if met at the wrong time under the wrong set of circumstances. Now, a player of mine, to this day, still bemoans the time when their doctor, who has survived dozens of dangerous encounters with hideous Call of Cthulhu monsters, basically succumbed to a pack of rabid dogs. He had gotten used to, he felt his character was invincible to a certain extent. I've defeated this servitor creature of Cthulhu and this other. Therefore, what's a couple of 3 dogs? Well, they basically tore him to shreds due to a few bad rolls. Now, bad rolls in RPGs can be fudged with, depending. I wouldn't recommend doing it extensively too often or to a great degree. But in horror RPGs, before GM goes and starts fudging rules to save a PC's life, I think the main question that needs to be asked is that PC's death, would it add to the game? In the sense that it would add to the feeling of dread, the menace, the perception of the menace, and also basically the overall body count of the game. If you're playing that type of slasher type RPG genre, or would it be better to let the PC live? Now, I would recommend that basically be on a case by case basis. But if it helps the atmosphere, and that's another aspect I want to talk about later, of the RPG, the horror RPG, then by all means, it may seem a little callous and a little cruel, but by all means, let the PC meet a grisly and spectacular death. In most horror systems, characters are fairly weak. We're talking about, again, I'm going to go back to the Call of Cthulhu system. And you're dealing with basically regular humans who, as adversaries, are at the very least very tough monsters, and at very worst, galaxy-shattering type beings from beyond. And PCs and horror campaigns tend to be like everyday people forced to combat horrors that they really have no business encountering. They are vulnerable to potentially crippling emotions at times when survival requires strong action. Remember, the key thing to remember is that this is horror. And in horror, players die or have their lives permanently changed, and more often than not always for the better. Now, there's different ways that this could happen, and it depends based on what type of horror game and what encounter is happening at the table at the time. Now, so if it's difficult, the question then becomes: so if it's difficult to build characters, build them up in level in horror RPGs, why do so many people enjoy horror RPGs? In RPG games? The answer is in the role playing itself. Since horror RPGs are dangerous, combat is usually minimized, and role playing encounters are more predominant in order to draw out emotions, the mood, and get the feel for the horror game being played. Now, players must relate to their characters and be pulled into the story at the same time, and this is generally more often than not accomplished by encouraging good role playing. This doesn't actually mean the numbers and number crunching and power gaming. What it means is role playing in the form of improvisational theater, or basically acting, basically, and getting into the actual feel of the campaign. Now, many find role playing easy in horror RPGs. Most characters are taken really from easily recognizable stereotypes, since most systems are set in a modified real world and are based on real time periods in our history. The setting is also familiar, not just to characters as well. Now, consequently, players can draw from their own experiences when bringing their character to life. A lot of times, I think it was one time said that some of the best writing one can do or create is from actual experience. Now, through investigation of the menace, characters frequently become changed by the horrors and by their experience. Again, in the Call of Cthulhu, investigators are driven towards insanity by what they uncover. Characters can be physically altered also by their own actions. Characters suffer from fear and horror reactions in just about every horror system RPG really that I've seen out there. Each change gives the player also a new opportunity for role playing. For example, in Call of Cthulhu, it's very interesting and fun to actually see how some players actually role play their PCs, their investigators, as they slowly slip into insanity and into madness. Also, parties in RPGs tend not to be a unified happy party. You can throw in also other elements for our role playing within these RPGs, like personal dislikes, squabbles, mismatched couples, etc., etc. There are more fun for players to play this way, and can help characters become more alive within a short period of time. Some of the best scenarios give players ample time to interact early on, and the horror plotline is gradually interjected. Now, I know that there's some of the best horror I've ever read is where in the beginning, the first few chapters, or even 1/3 of the way through a horror type story, it appears like you're reading basically a drama type book, whereas it's about a drama type story where horror really doesn't play into it until it slowly starts creeping into the interjected into the storyline. So while characters in horror RPGs tend to die quickly, there are some steps you can take, of course, to increase the character's longevity. Now, while I can't guarantee that this will help in every situation, it will cut down greatly. One of the first things that a PC or PC group to help them survive a horror campaign is to learn what you're up against. And before you encounter it, do background research. Check evidence left at crime scenes or other locations of interest. Research the library, occult bookstores. You might discover an obscure reference that might help. Has anyone, a little investigative work? Has anyone around town or around the Arctic Research Base recently encountered a similar creature and lived to tell about it? Does the scientist, fortune teller nearby have any useful information? You won't find it unless you check. And that's part of the fun of horror RPGs, is basically the investigation and the slow peeling back of the onion, if you will, the different layers, the different skins of the onion to, determine what really you're up against and what's really going on. And also a player might know, for example, that silver bullets are needed to destroy, say, like a werewolf in the campaign. But his character might not, unless he researches, and this has to do with in-game knowledge and real-world knowledge. Chances are, of success might be slim without advanced research into finding out what is happening within the community or where the horror game is taking place. So know your adversary. know what you're fighting up against. Are you battling a vampire? Are you battling some alien life form? The more research you do, the better equipped your character is going to be to survive an encounter or the scenario. Um, Now, on the other extreme, one of the most common pitfalls for beginners in the horror genre of RPGs is over investigation. A GM can hand players a summary and a thorough investigation, and they'll search the location again and again and again, and valuable time is lost really in this way. Many times, if it's not obvious or found during the first thorough search, it's quite likely that your GM, has set it up where it's just not there. So time to move on to the next scene or time to investigate a new location. Take the most obvious clues and follow up on them. Only look for something truly obscure if you have no other options. Now, also, to help PCs survive is also you need a plan, basically. And groups rarely succeed by accident, especially in horror RPGs. They usually have well thought out plans and have well executed plans. While not all plans will work, and even when they're due, not everyone's going to live through it, it's really no big deal. Modify the plans as you go. The trick is to keep your heads and keep a rational plan when things begin to go wrong. A good GM, will use every trick he or she can to come up with. Excuse me. Keep you from thinking and force you to react emotionally. Now, always remember to always, keep your head about yourselves when you're actually running a PC in a horror campaign. So a good part of it too is going to be luck. One of the things that is not talked about a lot in RPGs, except for probably horror RPGs, is the random aspect of luck. So a lot's going to depend on actual rolls and also modifying the plan as you go along. One good example, and I do recommend it's kind of campy, the movie, but it's a lot of fun, is you can check out the old Kevin Bacon movie, Tremors, which is a wonderful example, not the sequels, but the original first movie Tremors, was basically the characters and the actors in the film coming up with a plan and modifying the plan as they went. By using their heads, you had this little ragtag group defeat these intelligent creatures that could learn how to adapt to certain situations. Another aspect that will help your PC survive is to avoid unnecessary combat. Now, we all love combat in RPGs. It's where basically our PCs get to flex their muscle, use the new spell level we gained, check out the new, heavy plasma cannon or cyborg just acquired. But in horror RPGs, it's a little bit different in the sense that combat is best avoided if possible. Combat should always be the last course of action. Unlike fantasy RPGs, one cannot expect to solve most problems through direct assault. Many monsters will laugh and thank you for the opportunity to destroy the entire party at once if you all rush in and try to attack the monster at once. Concepts, and the reason for this is because concepts such as a balanced encounter typically do not apply in a horror role-playing games. Used sometimes, for example, I was running a tournament once, and I set up this encounter, and I rarely count opponents, and I try to make it fair for player characters. You have to basically pick your fights wisely if you're going to be going up against a major baddie in a horror type RPG setting. And one rule I can't stress enough is that when in doubt, run away. In horror RPGs, fact of the matter is you cannot defeat everything, and characters can easily become overwhelmed. It is better to retreat and to fight another day when you're better prepared or better have a better plan. And preparation does not necessarily mean carrying around, heavy weaponry. I know the temptation about for example, the 45 caliber handgun didn't work. Let's try the M16 or the rocket launcher. There are just some things that weapons cannot take out. For example, you could detonate a thermonuclear weapon on Cthulhu, and he'll respawn and come back 5 minutes later, and this time he's radioactive. So that's just a very visual example of sometimes direct assaults, and he with the most guns or most bullets is not, or the biggest sword, is not basically the way to go. Another survival technique for PCs in a horror type RPG is don't separate the party. Now, this is a basic rule of survival for all types of RPGs, but a lone character or even a small group cannot hope to survive an encounter tailored to the strength of an entire party. Now, in horror RPGs, where the adversaries can be much more than a match for the entire party, let alone a single PC, not separating is even more vital. So try to keep together, try to keep, don't let a certain PC, go tromping off into the cemetery at night on their own. Keep things cohesive and operate as a unit and as a group. Now, all intelligent monsters, if you do have a PC who decides he or she's going to go do their own thing, intelligent monsters, let's be honest, cannot resist a lone character on their own. They may not want to attack the party, but a chance to eliminate one, thereby weakening the whole party, would be pretty irresistible. So that's one of the aspects there. So always keep your PCs together in a group. Now, you would be surprised how often this is ignored. The problem is that violators are not always punished. The menace might not be nearby or just too stupid to take advantage of the situation. Other times the punishment is subtle, such as alerting the enemy to your presence or losing vital clues. Now, I cannot tell you how many times a lone character has discovered something important only to die, destroy it, or conceal it from the rest of the party until it's too late. So always communicate the PCs back and forth in character, what your character has found or discovered or new clues. So basically I'm going to wrap it up right here, and I'll talk a tiny bit more in a future video, hopefully, a little more about horror RPGs. So basically what I would recommend is that whether you're going to play a Call of Cthulhu, a Vampire the Masquerade, or a werewolf type White Wolf game, or some other horror campaign, even a homebrew one, give it a try. It's good for change of pace type games. It's good for putting together, if you're a fantasy game, you want to take a break from that, put together a horror campaign. Even if it's just a one-shot or perhaps maybe 2, 3, or even 4 different session type of horror games. They're a lot of fun and definitely something worth looking into. Till next time, I hope you enjoyed this video. Leave any comments you have below, likes or dislikes, and I'll talk to everyone here on YouTube next time.